Then I can talk about history. So hand launch started out in the United States pretty much, as hard as that is to believe. A lot of the soaring seems to come from Europe. But the Americans are the innovators, and then the Europeans tend to make contests out of things in competitions and write the rules. So I think cowboys. But hand launch used to be it started out sort of in California because that's the only place where the thermals were strong enough to carry the gear aloft that you could launch with your hand. So back in the old days, you used to launch sailplanes with a winch or a bungee cord. And the winch, I actually have one in the truck, is a spool of thread and goes out to a pulley and then comes back. And you hook that pulley or that cord to your plane, and you step on the pedal for the winch, and it pulls the string around the pulley and pulls the plane up in the air. And so that's winching up. And that was really common. And then you'd see the bungee, so almost the same thing. You have a bungee with a string on it, stretch it back, you let go of the plane, it goes. And so that was really popular, 60s and 70s, I think. Big poly planes, and then they started putting more servos in the wings. And as the radio gear got lighter and lighter, they'd start building smaller planes. And then the other really big thing, particularly in California, was slope flying. So slope flying is that cold, uniform water coming off the ocean hits the land and slopes up. And that is really useful because now there's this up. And you can, if my leg's the slope, you can fly out in front of the wind and get lift with your glider going back and forth on that slope. And you can do aerobatics, loops and rolls and all kinds of things. And so a lot of the California guys had those slopers, and they would do racing with the slopers. And they found that different size planes flew differently, and it was sort of fun to have competitions with different size planes. And one of the smallest sizes was a 60-inch sloper. And so there were guys who had these 60-inch slopers. And when it was a light day on the slope, you'd build a lighter sloper so it'd still stay up. And so just 1 or 2 mile an hour wind off the ocean with a light enough plane, you could slope soar that. And so there's a convergence of that 60-inch racer that was really lightweight and those guys flying winch. And they realized that they could, and on the slope you only ever throw your plane. But they realized if they had a light enough sloper, they could throw it and catch one of those thermals that they're catching with the winches. And that was sort of how hand launch was born. They started building lighter and lighter planes that could perform in the thermal that they could then throw overhand. And so that picks up, and in probably early 70s was the very first hand launch contest, maybe 80s even, because the gear was just huge. You know, we're talking NICADs and S48 servos and big stuff. And so the hand launch wasn't super practical. And then when I started getting into it in the 90s, there's actually a really popular company down in Dayton area, DJ Aerotech. Anybody heard of DJ Aerotech? Jim has. Yeah, that was a long time ago. Don and Joe, I still see Don posts on Facebook. I haven't seen Joe much, but they're still alive. They had these neat little planes called Monarchs, and they flew just like a Monarch butterfly. A lot of polyhedral and V-tail and super light. And they were able to take the lightest gear available and a lot of camber in the foils and actually fly around and launch for... Jeez. It's windy out here. Everybody staying dry? Or is this silly? Good enough? Okay. Okay, so sorta. I don't know if it's better downwind or not, but you're welcome to find another seat. Um, so that convergence of the gear and the practicality of uh, of different things made it where hand launch became practical. And so early 90s, you'd see some built up planes, balsa with monocoque, and then later on it was composite. The DJ Aerotech were balsa over white foam, and that was super fun. And then the Nats would have 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 people in them in the 90s, and that was super fun over in Muncie. Woo. And so you'd see, and then people knew what high performance looked like in that the bigger planes, the winch launch planes, had the higher performance airfoils on it. And so the 2 meter, 3 meter RG-15 airfoils, and then there started being Selig did some really interesting low speed wind tunnel testing in the 90s and started developing some new airfoils with a little higher performance. And so you'd see that, and then it slowly penetrated down, and we started designing some new airfoils for the planes, and using the available technology to increase performance. And so the big contests were the Nats, and Poway was super big because that's sort of where hand launch had started there in California. And we started seeing more and more composite planes, and almost all these small companies doing stuff. But still, the rules were in the AMA rulebook. Category 441 was hand launch, and we just started doing more and more. I mentioned my contests out in Seattle. I moved out there in 1997 to work at Boeing, and there was a pretty good cadre of winch pilots and a few hand launch crazies. And one of them, Steve Cameron, flew the Orbiter built-up plane. He came to the Nats and actually won the Nats. And Dodgson said, "If you win the Nats, I'll kit this plane." And so he won the Nats, and poor Dodgson had to kit the plane. I built one. It was the most fiddly, lightweight planes I'd ever built. And boy, I worked really hard, and that baby came down to 11.5 ounces. What's that in grams? A lot of grams. 330. So that ballast vortex I was flying this morning, it's about 350 with the ballast in it. So so I would never fly that Orbiter in this wind. But we started getting more and more technology, and it was all overhand. So we had these contests, and in about 96, 97, Harold Locke out in Seattle realized that if you held on to the wingtip of the plane and you do a downward motion and up, you could throw it really high. Unfortunately, you could only get about 44-inch wingspan because your arm hits the ground eventually. So that was called sidearm launch. So you're like this, and you go like this, and you throw it up in the air. And he designed a plane called the Tactical Air, and it was a cool little plane that you could sidearm launch, and you could launch higher than they could throw overhand, but with the limited wingspan, your performance wasn't as good. So you could use it as a tactical weapon to wait for the other guy to find the thermal, and then throw higher than him into the better air, high up in the thermal, and still win the contest. So that was sidearm launch. Now, a friend of mine, Dick Barker, had seen us doing the sidearm launch, and he's like, "I wonder if I could do that with a full-size plane if at the poly brake I put a little tab, and so he's holding it at the poly brake halfway up the wing. And it was sort of successful. And then Dick had thrown discus in college. And so he knew about spinning around. And he knew what the footwork sort of was, kind of thing. And at some point, that sidearm thing with the thing, he spun all the way around. And wow, he could really throw it far. And then he said, well, what if we held on to the wingtip? That'd be even longer. So you got more distance out to where the center of mass is, sort of a slingshot or an atlatl kind of thing. What if I held on to the wingtip, just the wingtip? And that's when Discus Launch was born. And so Dick was probably in his 60s at the time, not in great shape, smoker, big pot belly, and he would spin around and launch that plane higher than I could throw overhand. And I'm like, okay, there's something here. And so it was pretty obvious to most of us that that was going to be the thing. Although it didn't catch on right away. Dick would go out and proselytize at different contests. And people would sort of be impressed, but he wasn't a great pilot. And so it didn't quite catch on. And then the plane wasn't really super well designed. I have an older Discus Launch. I'll show you that if it stops raining. And some of the early innovations. As you throw sidearm, there's a lot more side forces on the tail. And so you have to change your tail design. And the harder you throw, the stronger that has to be. And so there was some real development work that needed to be done to make those practical. Because when he started out, it was sort of an overhand design. So Dick Barker has, there's some other people that claim that they did the Discus Launch earlier, but it really caught on after Dick did it. So I give him most of the credit. So he's gone around, and up north we'd adopted the Discus Launch, and Phil Pearson started designing some planes that ultimately became the Encores. And then it really caught on when Joe Wirtz, who is a world-class competitor, he's won just about every soaring event there is over 20 years. He's California native, worked at Lockheed Skunk Works. He was out at his club field throwing his hand launch, and he was a really good thrower, even though he was left-handed. He was really really good pilot, but also a strong thrower. And he was getting out-thrown overhand by a guy who'd only been flying a couple years with the Discus Launch. And Joe says, I'm not going to put up with that. And so he called up to Phil and got some encores down for Poway. And so, like, one year, probably 2002, there were 10 people throwing discus, and by 2003, everybody was throwing discus. It was just like that. And that was when it took over. And that's actually when the Europeans got interested. They came to Poway, saw how successful and useful it was, and adopted it, and hand launch became a real thing in Europe. And that's when they wrote the rule book, and F3K was invented. Jim.
I don't know if you were there, ICD, the first nationals contest in Discus Launch.
Okay.
And Paul Siegel won that.
Yeah. Disco Girl, yeah. Yeah, that's
an interesting time.
Yeah, it sure is. So
people were trying to circumvent the rules by finding all different devices to launch planes with.
Yeah.
So it's pretty interesting time.
Yeah, and fortunately they didn't just rule it out. There was talk of that. I'm happy they didn't, because it's so much easier on your body to discus launch than to overhand. And so I think that was a real plus for the community, is that they didn't rule that out. But yeah, Paul had seen the Discus out in California. He'd come to Poway, and he used to fly Monarchs, and then he put it together that this is the way to go, and he got a plane together and flew it at the Nats and won that. What was that? 202 or 3? It's a blur.
Probably around 2002,
Yeah. So and then like I said, the Europeans did the rules. F3K. You'll hear F is for FAI, and 3 is for soaring events without motors. And then K because they did it in alphabetical order, and K was the next one that needed a name. So J was right before that with the tow launch thermal duration, and then K was after that. And then yeah, so that's F3K, and it's taken over, and the technology keeps moving. The planes don't look as different as they were in the early days, new ones versus old ones. But there's been different airfoil development that's gone on in different style. And then everything's about getting the weight out. That's really important. But also getting the drag down and moving towards that ultimate design. Any questions on the history there? Lots of good stuff. I do like to scratch build airplanes and repair things and everything in composites, and composites are a real exciting place for me. I'm contemplating doing a clinic in my garage maybe this winter on at least repairs, if not hand launch construction. Keep an eye out for that. Yeah, as both Daniel and Alexi will attest, I can repair just about anything. So if you do crash your expensive composite plane, let me know. Don't throw it away. Let's at least take a look at it. It's likely repairable, and we may not add too much weight, really. I've been pretty successful with the repairs of late.